There is the faintest ticking on the wall in front of me. It reminds me, by way of clock, which happens to carry the verse, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, at this evening before the great and do or die day in the minds of some is coming to an end. Also a fitting reminder that God's faithfulness to restore all things according to his original intents and purposes from the very beginning point of creation is getting that much closer. We interrupt our reading of John's account of the Gospel of Jesus Christ to go now to Matthew's Gospel. And we are going to reread over the parallel account of Jesus before Pilate. And there's something that needs to be said and learned. I would probably not make comment on all of them. Hopefully, whoever is watching this, listening, is listening with both of their ears. Book of Matthew. When daybreak came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. After tying him up, they led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that Jesus had been condemned, was full of remorse, and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. I have sinned by betraying innocent blood, he said. Judas knew Jesus was being killed under the allegations of committing blasphemy, so I'll let you do whatever you need to in your own mind to figure out whether or not Judas ended up with eternal salvation or not. I personally think that business is between Judas and Jesus, and you have other things to worry about. What is that to us, they said. See to it yourself. So he threw the silver into the temple and departed, and then he went and hanged himself. The chief priest took the silver and said, it is not permitted to put it into the temple treasury, since it is blood money. They conferred together and bought the potter's field with it as a burial place for foreigners. Therefore that field has been called Blood Field to this day. Then what was spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him whose price was set by the Israelites, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. Now Jesus stood before the governor. Are you the king of the Jews? The governor asked him. Jesus answered, you say so. While he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he didn't answer. Then Pilate said to him, don't you hear how much they are testifying against you? But he didn't answer him on even one charge, so that the governor was quite amazed. At the festival, the governor's custom was to release to the crowd a prisoner they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, who is it you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? For he knew it was because of envy that they had handed him over. In the last reading, from John's account of this, we actually see how Jesus was the only person not ruled by fear in that entire situation. The disciples ruled by fear. The people who came to arrest Jesus overtaken by fear, and rightly so, at the pronouncement of Jesus' name, Jesus' pronouncement of his divine personal name. The fear of the Jewish people that wanted Jesus dead over not killing him, and also of not seeming to be in violation of the law as they did so. And then you had the fear of Peter and the rest of the disciples, Peter specifically, in what I read. Then you have the fear of Pilate also. Jesus, the one about to be brutalized and killed, is the only person not afraid. Why? Because he is the way, the truth, and the life. Because he had been there and he had been sent there to do the thing he was doing. There were no surprises in store for Jesus, because he knew the Father is faithful, and he was counting on that faithfulness. Suffer first, then the glory of God is magnified, and God's faithfulness comes to bear. While he was sitting on the judge's bench, his wife sent word to him, "Here's more fear. Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for today I've suffered terribly in a dream because of him." The chief priests and the elders, however, persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to execute Jesus. The governor asked them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" "Barabbas," they answered. Pilate asked them, "Well, what should I do then with Jesus, who is called Christ?" Let's understand what this rendering of this account actually says. The Greek word that is translated for Christ here would have been understood by the Hebrew listeners as Messiah. Okay? Pilate just told them that they were dealing with Yeshua Mashiach. I probably said that wrong. They all answered, "Crucify him." He said, "Why? What has he done wrong?" They kept shouting all the more, "Crucify him." And Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that a riot was starting instead. He took some water, washed his hands in front of the crowd, and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." All the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, and after having Jesus flogged, handed him over to be crucified. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the governor's residence and gathered the whole company around him. They stripped him and dressed him in a scarlet robe. They twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and placed a staff in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and mocked him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they spat on him, took the staff, and kept hitting him on the head. After they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe, put his own clothes on him, and led him away to crucify him. I read that second account of Jesus' beating in Pilate's mansion for a very specific reason, and that reason is because I want to get in people's minds that there is a false worship that seems to be a very common thing. Jesus himself said, "In fact, it will come to be that the people who kill you will think that they are doing so in the service of God." People will feign worship. People will, let's listen to this. People will feign worship and loyalty to Christ in the time coming up. Don't be drawn in. That's all I'm going to say about that. I'm going to say a lot more. But... So, back to John. Then they took Jesus away. Carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him and two others with him, one on either side, with Jesus in the middle. Pilate also had a sign made and put on the cross. Pilate's next attempt to tell people what they were doing. They truly had no excuse. The Gentile Roman pagan governor was telling them what they were doing. Pilate also had a sign made and put on the cross. It said, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, Don't write the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. Denial of the truth. Twisting the evidence that people see, twisting the narrative to make a more favorable justification for the atrocity being committed. Pilate replied, What I have written, I have written. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, a part for each soldier. They also took the tunic, which was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, Let's not tear it, but cast lots for it, to see who gets it. This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that says, Have you guys been paying attention to how many times the phrase, this happened that the scripture might be fulfilled? That says, They divided my clothes among themselves, and they cast lots for my clothing. This is what the soldiers did. The soldiers, the Gentile, pagan soldiers charged with ending or seeing to the end of Jesus' life, were the fulfillment of prophecy. Standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, whoever that is, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple he loved standing there, he said to his mother, Here he is, in the midst of the suffering, that is the prelude to the fulfillment of God's faithfulness. In the midst of the suffering, in the very depths of the suffering, he's looking to others. He said to his mother, Woman, here is your son. And he said to the disciple, Here is your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. After this, when Jesus knew that everything was now finished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, after he had seen to both the prophetic messiahship and, this must be noted, the Israeli law to make provision for his family before his death as the oldest child. Joseph was not in the picture anymore at this point. All things were fulfilled, even this last thing. He said, I'm thirsty. A jar full of sour wine was sitting there. So they fixed a sponge full of sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it up to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, Tetelestai, paid in full. And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. Since it was preparation day, the Jews did not want the bodies to remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a special day. Again, giving the appearance of adhering to the Holy Script, to the Holy Law, they requested that Pilate have the man's legs broken and that their bodies be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first man and of the other one who had been crucified with him. When they came to Jesus, they did not break his legs, since they saw that he was already dead. But when the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. He who saw this has testified, so that you also may believe. His testimony, John speaking of himself, is true, and he knows he is telling the truth. For these things happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled, not one of his bones will be broken. Also, another scripture says, they will look at the one they pierced. Another gospel account says, as soon as the blood and water started flowing from the puncture wound, One of the Roman soldiers said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." After this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because of his fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might remove Jesus' body. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and took his body away. Nicodemus, who had previously come to him at night, John again place setting, giving reminders to the reader of the historical relevance of this person, tying everything together, also came. John 3, by the way. Bringing a mixture of about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. They took Jesus' body and wrapped it. This is, again, the same process that was used for Lazarus. They took Jesus' body and wrapped it in linen cloths with the fragrant spices, according to the burial custom of the Jews. There was a garden in the place where he was crucified. A new tomb was in the garden. No one had yet been placed in it. They placed Jesus there because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was nearby. On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark. She saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she went running to Simon Peter and to the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said to them, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him." At that, Peter and the other disciple went out, heading for the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and got to the tomb first. Stooping down, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then, following him, Simon Peter also came. He entered the tomb and saw the linen cloths lying there. The wrapping that had been on his head was not lying with the linen cloths, but was folded up in a separate place by itself. The other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, then also went in, saw, and believed, for they did not yet understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to the place where they were staying. But Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she was crying, she stooped to look into the tomb. She saw two angels in white sitting where Jesus' body had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "Because they've taken away my Lord," she told them, "and I don't even know where they've put him." Pausing here, let's look at the human side of this narrative. This woman, I'm not sure which Mary. Let's see. Do they tell us which Mary? Mary Magdalene. Comes to the tomb, wanting to tend to the Lord, still in the grief over everything that had happened, still inside that weight of loss, the horror of the atrocities visited upon the Lord. And all she wanted to do was come and do one last loving act, and his body's gone. She can't even do that. Suddenly, the realization of the totality of every dashed hope in that moment came to bear. She wasn't even going to be allowed to worship as she wanted to. She had been denied that. And the weight of it crushed her, broke her, made her sob. The Jesus she was looking for was gone. The act of worship that she had intended to give him was removed from her. And it broke her heart. I don't know where they've put him. Having said this, she turned around. Here's the sorrow, or there was the sorrow, and now we have the blessed, joyous explosion of the realization of the faithfulness of the promise. Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know it was Jesus at first. "Woman," Jesus said to her, "why are you crying? Who is it that you're seeking?" Still in grief, still not believing or understanding, supposing he was the gardener, she replied, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." Turning around, she had said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus told her. Again, denied the one thing she wanted to do. But still, the joy that, true to his word, Jesus had come back. "Since I have not yet ascended to the Father, but you have work to do, go to my brothers and tell them that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them what he had said to her. This is where we're at now. We are in the suffering that leads to the final revelation of the faithfulness of God and the fulfillment of the promises to him. The things that we want to do in order to serve the Lord and feel like we're being pleasing to him very well could be taken away from us, especially if the only thing you know how to do is go to a building and sit for a scheduled amount of time and do a scheduled program of stuff. And you find that doing those things is only going to increase your sorrow. Something very important in that, I think, coming up here pretty quick. Continuing on momentarily.